Well, welcome back. Welcome back. This is the penultimate session. It's a very brief one, but to me, it's on motivational grounds a super important one. This is where we're going to announce to the world that Blacksburg is ground zero for the development of all things blockchain, and I have two gentlemen who've agreed that they will agree with that story, or at least partly. So when we started in thinking about this event about 18 months ago, one thing that we discovered is, of course, that there is a very deep network of people involved in the tech industry in Blacksburg. And I've mentioned the story many times today already, but I remember a conversation with Manu that I had, and where he told me what he was doing, and it took me, and I'm modest on that one, about 3 years to fully comprehend what it was until I fully understood how far ahead of the game they were. And that conversation took place in about 2011 or something. And so what I wanted to engage the two of you in a conversation in is to give me a sort of a context. How do we think about Blacksburg's role in all of this? Of course, we can't make the extraordinary claims that I've just suggested, but you know, it's like the pink camel. Once you've uttered it, it's difficult to unthink it. So I'm hoping for that. But Peter, how did it start for you?
Well, it started for me, at least. I was working at another company, another software company here in Blacksburg, Phoenix Integration, and Dan Larimer was also working there. Mm-hmm. So I met Dan Larimer. We worked together on, a project, and it's a small company. And right about the same time, Dan, in fact, I learned the word blockchain from him. He was the guy. There was a really funny John Oliver show not too long ago where he was talking about blockchain, and he was talking about how people only know about blockchain because there's this really annoying guy called Dan in your office who can't shut up about it. Well, Dan Larimer was that guy in our office. But he's not really annoying, but he did in fact explain to all of us what this was all about, mm-hmm. and why it was important. And that was right about the same time that he was thinking about starting his first venture. And it so happened that we were working on a project it was very difficult, and we had to hire outside contractors. So we hired some people that I knew from years ago, the Synapticat, actually, the company I work for now, to work on the project. So the guy in charge of Synapticat, his name is Dan also, Dan Notstein, and he worked with Dan Larimer on this project, so they both got to know each other. It just so happens that they're very compatible ideologically, mm-hmm. and they're both, talented software developers. So when Dan Larimer started his first, BitShares venture, he, got Synapticat involved in that because, he needed people to help him out. So we did the back end, as I mentioned earlier. So Dan Larimer has started 3 blockchain-based companies since that time. Dan Notstein 2. So mm-hmm. 5 of the companies, are the result of, these 2 guys that happened to meet each other, in Blacksburg, a few years ago. And I think one of the questions here is, what is it about Blacksburg that made that happen? Well, one of the answers is just luck. These 2 guys met each other, and they did some cool things. But there are some fundamental reasons, I think. Blacksburg mm-hmm. is ideally sized. There's a big technical university that produces a lot of entrepreneurially minded graduates who then want to live here. We're all, I myself am a tech graduate who just wanted to live in Blacksburg because I think it's a great place to live, and a lot of the folks around me are that way too. Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, there are not a lot of big places to hire technical folks here. You're sort of always, you're kind of limited to, I shouldn't say limited, but you're thinking about, be starting a business or joining a small
Right.
business if you're here. So I think those properties of the region kind of help. But that's kind of how I explain this.
Sure. So it's a unique ecosystem, and in fact, if one looks at there is a fascinating book called The American College Town that sort of portrays a variety of college towns. And Blacksburg is featured in there, and Blacksburg, in that sense, I've been thinking about this a lot too, because I returned from Ann Arbor, Michigan to live in Blacksburg, is fairly unique in the sense that it's both remote, but also relatively central in terms of it's 3 hours to Charlotte, 4 hours to the capital of the free world. Yet it is a small community. And so, Manu, would you subscribe to these principles of Blacksburg being a special place?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. So I ended up coming to Blacksburg because of the Blacksburg Electronic Village. Does anybody remember that? There was this awesome, so that was a long time ago for those of you that raised your hands. But there was this promise that, there was this tiny little village nestled in the mountains. I'm not from Virginia. In fact, born in Sri Lanka and lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and West Virginia, and California, and all kinds of different places. There was this promise of this tiny little college town that was so wildly interconnected with one another and was at it was on the first tier of the internet, meaning that they had Ethernet cable running to housing, which was crazy at the time. You had all the internet access that you could want. And being a computer scientist, I was like, what better place to be? The internet's taking off. That's where it's happening. And so that's what drew me to Blacksburg in the first place. And then once I did my degree here, I was like, this place is great. I don't want to leave. There were plenty of job opportunities out in Silicon Valley in New York City. And I was like, well, these mountains, the mountains here, the Blue Ridge Mountains, actually look a lot like the mountains in Sri Lanka. So growing up, I'd look out the front window and there'd be this amazing Blue Ridge, and I had the same, experience here. And so I said, this feels like home, but there are no jobs. So what do I do? And the only answer at that point was start your own business. Start a company, start anything. And we got involved in trying to figure out a way to get the internet to reach the world's unbanked and underbanked, the people that had been left out of society, the people that were not worthy enough to have a bank account and save for their families and provide for an education and healthcare. And we saw the internet and the web as this amazing tool to potentially provide that kind of security to families, not only in the developed world, but in the developing world as well. And so we started thinking about, how can we extend payments through the web? How can we extend identity through the web? And it was around 2009, 2010, where this blockchain stuff came along, and we were already well on our way creating international standards and working with Google and Facebook and Microsoft to try to build out the next generation web. And this blockchain thing came along, and we said, that has got to be the stupidest idea that I've ever heard of. Who in the world would ever use such a technology? It's not, everything's out there in the public. It depends on this public-private cryptography. Nobody understands it. Nobody understands what they're getting into. And we were fairly vocal about it. We said, blockchain technology is there's so much smoke and mirrors and snake oil going on. And we were very, we were skeptics and continue to be skeptics in a certain way. But what happened is at one point the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the DHS said, hey, we've noticed that you're kind of being skeptical about this technology. We want you to prove without a shadow of a doubt, look at the source code of Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these different blockchains, prove without a shadow of a doubt the things that you can do from a payments and an identity perspective and the things that you cannot do. And so from a scientific perspective, we started analyzing it and going, oh yeah, there is actually something here. 90% of the stuff that people are saying, the problems that are going to be solved, are very hard human social problems. Blockchain technology is a part of that solution, but it's not not everything. So it was interesting, starting a company. I've now started 5 companies in Blacksburg. One of the things that's really great about Blacksburg, how many of your students in the audience right now? Go ahead and raise your hand. So the majority of you are students. So, this is specifically intended for you. Blacksburg gives you a real competitive advantage when it comes to technology, right? So while all of my friends out in Silicon Valley, New York City are talking about we're ready to do a startup, we've got the VC almost lined up, we're 3 years into a company and already executing on something that they want to do. One of the things that is really hard to do in Silicon Valley and New York City is survive for an extended period of time. When you do a startup, you have to be like a cockroach, right? You have to be unkillable. And one of the things that helps you do that is a really good quality of life, a non-existent commute if you can walk or bike into work, housing that's affordable. All of these things really help, and then being attached to a research university really gives you an advantage. So we find that with a small $2 million to $5 million raise, we can compete head-to-head with a company that's raised $50 million in VC in Silicon Valley. And I think that's one of the really fantastic things about Blacksburg is it helps you survive while you work on really hard, world-changing ideas.
Yeah, wow. So in that sense, there is a comparative advantage to the location. This will be of interest, of course, to the urban economists in the room, so that there are certain types of advantage. In terms of the disadvantages, do both of you feel that the lack of centrality, the access to areas that display some of the problems that the blockchain is geared to resolving might be an issue, that one is too far away from the applied problem, or is that just an overthinking of coming up with negatives on a deal that seems to be too good to be true? And we're hoping that many of the listeners will flock to purchase their first home in Blacksburg, but not too many.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think Blacksburg has achieved somewhat of a, there's a delicate balancing act here of, being attractive but not attracting too many people. And as Mano said, there's an almost non-existent commute. I like to call it not a rush hour, it's a rush 10 minutes. And, we all appreciate that, obviously, but it's also been written about in, best places to live
That is true.
Publication. So you kind of wonder, is this going to last, or is it stable?
Let me add on an additional question to sort of try to understand the self-selection of like-minded people. You mentioned the electronic village.
Yeah.
To what extent can I make the outrageous claim that what we're seeing today has the roots that go as far back as the 1970s and that movement?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is self-selecting in a sense. It's hard to pinpoint exactly, how that translates to particular technologies being developed. But there's no question that we are a, technological community. We are a hands-on community. We're also an academic community. And all these things sort of blend together to create things like, the blockchain, or things like, better internet technologies. And so it's, it has those properties, but it's hard to make predictions based on just general properties like that. I think, perhaps as our knowledge of analytics and artificial intelligence improves, maybe we'll be able to.
Well, yeah, I mean, here's a term paper suggestion for social sciences students. Do a sort of an origins tree or a pedigree of also following companies in terms of what they, because the one thing that surprised us when we began to look is that all of you had connections one way or the other. That when one looks at it, it's all connected. Which can be a function of size only, but I think that would be not doing justice to it, only to say that it's just because so small, everybody's related.
One of the interesting things that I've found So we're very entrenched in the blockchain community. So we go to all the conferences. There are design salons that are invite only that we go to talk about and think about the next generation, internet and the web. And one of the advantages that I think we have in Blacksburg, other than the financial advantage, there is a space issue, right? So anytime I want to talk about this is the first time I've been able to talk about blockchain and literally walk down the street to do it. Usually it's a commute out to Roanoke Airport, a flight to DC, and then Paris or Frankfurt or Japan or Bali. We spend a lot of time on planes so that we can go out and interact with the blockchain community or the web community. But one of the things that we've realized is that the people that participate in those communities, these technology communities that are building the next generation internet and the web, the most prolific contributors are the ones that live in small communities. And I think this is the theory, and again, this is a research paper. Blacksburg, at least to me, all of our engineers have space to think, right? We have our walks home, we have our bike rides home, we have, we're not fighting traffic, we're not fighting, a hectic, huge city. And that extra time to think lets us work on really, really hard problems, right? Global scale problems. And I think one of the problems in Silicon Valley and New York City is that there is a constant distraction. There's always somebody doing a launch event or a drop-in or a conference or a meetup. And while those are great for social connectivity reasons, that's a really great output that I don't think we have here. The downside to that is that you don't have time to sit down and think and solve the hard problems. So I think that's one of the benefits that communities like that give. It's the academic setting. It's the small community. It's the time to yourself to really work on those hard problems.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think we have to leave it. This is certainly a very profound statement, and I think a fitting one for us to take into the next section, because we do have this crowdedness complication of our modern lives in terms of thoughts that are constantly disrupted. And so thank you both. We're now inviting all panelists, previous panelists, up on the stage so that we can bring the formal section of the symposium to an end before we continue it at 3 o'clock elsewhere at the Alexander Black House in a more informal setting. And so please do join us.